I've told a lot of stories about the mistakes I made when I was younger, but this one sits differently. Maybe because nobody got robbed. Nobody got beaten. Nobody even got touched. What I did was simpler than that. I made people afraid. Back then, I was 27, working nights at a small warehouse outside town. The pay was terrible, the management was worse, and everyone walked around angry at someone. Angry at their boss. Angry at their spouse. Angry at life. I fit right in. The thing about fear is that most people imagine it arrives with something obvious: a weapon, a violent person, a disaster. What I learned was that fear doesn't need any of those things. Sometimes all it needs is uncertainty. At the time, I felt invisible. Nobody listened to me. Nobody respected me. If I complained, I was ignored. If I spoke up, people talked over me. Every day felt like proof that I didn't matter. Then one afternoon, I overheard a conversation that planted an idea in my head. Two supervisors were discussing an anonymous threat another company had received months earlier. Nothing had happened. No attack. No crime. Just a message. Yet according to them, the entire workplace had practically shut down for days. That fascinated me. A few words from an unknown person had controlled the behavior of hundreds. The thought should have disturbed me. Instead, it intrigued me. I started wondering how much power fear really had. How quickly people would change their behavior if they believed danger was nearby. How easily uncertainty could spread from one person to another. At first it was just a passing curiosity. Then it became an obsession. And that obsession eventually led me to commit one of the most shameful crimes of my life, not because of what I physically did, but because of what I made other people believe. Looking back, that was the moment everything started. The moment I stopped asking whether I could do it, and started wondering what would happen if I did. For weeks, I couldn't get that conversation out of my head. Every shift at the warehouse gave me a new reason to dwell on it. Management kept cutting corners, supervisors barked orders at people already exhausted, and complaints disappeared into a void. Everyone grumbled, but nobody did anything. I started telling myself that fear was the only thing people actually responded to. That's how the rationalizations began. I wasn't thinking about causing physical harm. In my mind, I was planning a disruption, a wake-up call. Something that would force people to pay attention. Looking back, that's the lie I used to make myself comfortable with the idea. The more I thought about it, the more I noticed how vulnerable the workplace was to rumors. One strange incident could dominate conversations for days. People filled gaps in information with their own worst assumptions. I became fascinated by that. Eventually, I stopped thinking like an employee and started thinking like someone conducting an experiment. That was the point where curiosity quietly became intent. Once I crossed the line from curiosity to intent, I started planning more seriously than I cared to admit. I didn't rush. In fact, I spent nearly a month thinking through every detail, convincing myself that caution somehow made what I was doing acceptable. My goal was simple: create a believable threat without creating any actual danger. I wanted people to think something bad might happen, not make anything bad happen. That distinction felt important to me at the time. I paid attention to routines around the warehouse. I noted when supervisors arrived, who checked the mail, and how information spread through the building. The place practically ran on gossip. One rumor at the loading docks could reach the office within an hour. I also made sure nothing could be traced back to me easily. I avoided discussing my frustrations with coworkers and acted completely normal during shifts. The strangest part is how calm I felt. Instead of recognizing that I was preparing to commit a crime, I treated it like solving a puzzle. That should have been my warning sign. The day I finally acted felt strangely ordinary. I woke up, had coffee, watched television for a while, and spent most of the afternoon pretending I wasn't about to do something I had been planning for weeks. By then, I had already drafted the message several times. Each version sounded either too dramatic or too vague. I wanted it to seem credible enough to trigger concern but not so specific that it immediately attracted intense scrutiny. The balance mattered. That evening, I delivered the message anonymously. The moment it was out of my hands, reality hit me. For weeks, everything had existed inside my head as a hypothetical situation. Now it was real. I remember sitting in my car afterward, staring through the windshield, waiting for some feeling of satisfaction to arrive. Instead, I felt nervous. Not guilty yet, just nervous. My phone seemed louder than usual. Every passing police car caught my attention. Every stranger looked suspicious. For the first time, I understood that planning something and actually doing it were completely different experiences. And there was no way to undo what I'd started. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. I wanted to see the reaction from the beginning, though I told myself it was only curiosity. The atmosphere felt different before I even entered the building. Small groups of employees stood together in the parking lot, talking quietly. People who normally joked around looked serious. A security vehicle was parked near the entrance, and supervisors were moving back and forth with expressions I had never seen before. The message had been discovered. Within an hour, the entire warehouse was buzzing with speculation. Nobody knew exactly what was going on, which somehow made everything worse. Every person seemed to have a different version of the story. Some thought a disgruntled employee was involved. Others believed an outsider had targeted the company. Listening to those conversations was unsettling. The fear wasn't coming from the message anymore. It was growing from people's imaginations. What shocked me most was how quickly uncertainty spread. Facts barely mattered. Assumptions filled every gap. And as I stood there pretending to be just another concerned employee, I realized the situation was already becoming bigger than I had intended. By the second day, the situation had escalated far beyond what I had imagined. Management held emergency meetings. Security procedures changed overnight. Employees were being questioned about anything unusual they might have seen or heard. What started as a single anonymous message was now controlling the behavior of hundreds of people. That realization gave me a strange rush. I hate admitting that. Part of me felt powerful. People who normally ignored me were distracted, anxious, and uncertain. Supervisors who acted untouchable suddenly looked worried. The entire workplace revolved around a threat that didn't even exist. But another part of me was becoming uncomfortable. I noticed how stressed some employees looked. One older coworker admitted he barely slept because he was worried about coming to work. Another called his family during a break just to reassure them everything was okay. Those conversations stayed with me. This wasn't some abstract social experiment anymore. Real people were carrying the fear home with them. For the first time, I considered walking away and hoping the whole thing faded. Unfortunately, events were already moving in a direction I couldn't control. The first sign of real trouble came when investigators started appearing around the warehouse. Until then, I had assumed management would treat the threat as a temporary problem and move on once nothing happened. I was wrong. People from outside the company arrived and began asking questions. They interviewed employees, reviewed records, and examined anything that might help identify where the message had come from. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Fear was no longer directed at an unknown threat. Now people were worried about being suspected. Conversations became cautious. Rumors multiplied. Every unusual detail became evidence in someone's theory. I tried to act normal, but I found myself paying too much attention to everything. Whenever investigators walked past me, my heart started racing. Whenever my supervisor asked a simple question, I wondered if it meant something more. Nobody accused me of anything. Nobody even looked at me suspiciously. Yet I was constantly on edge. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had created fear to influence others, and now I was experiencing my own version of it every single day. That was the beginning of the paranoia. For nearly a week, I convinced myself I was safe. The investigation continued, but nothing seemed to point in my direction. I started believing that my precautions had worked and that eventually the whole situation would fade away. Then I made a mistake. Not a dramatic mistake. Not the kind you see in movies where someone leaves fingerprints everywhere or blurts out a confession. It was much smaller than that. During a break, a group of coworkers started discussing the threat. Everyone was sharing theories, and I joined the conversation like I usually did. At one point, without thinking, I criticized a detail in one person's explanation. The problem was that the detail hadn't been made public. I knew it because I had written it. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt my stomach drop. Nobody reacted immediately. The conversation continued. People kept talking. But one coworker gave me a strange look. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I imagined it. Still, for the rest of the day, I replayed that moment over and over in my head. Fear had made me careless. And now I couldn't stop wondering whether someone had noticed. After that conversation, I became obsessed with damage control. The coworker's glance might have meant absolutely nothing, but once fear settles into your mind, every small detail starts looking significant. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. At work, I acted exactly as I always had. I joined casual conversations, complained about long shifts, and even participated in discussions about the investigation. My goal was to appear completely ordinary. The harder I tried, the less natural it felt. Every interaction became a performance. I paid attention to people's expressions when they spoke to me. If someone paused before answering, I assumed they were suspicious. If two employees stopped talking when I approached, I immediately imagined they were discussing me. Looking back, most of that existed only in my head. The real problem wasn't that others were watching me. The real problem was that I was watching myself. For the first time since sending the threat, guilt began mixing with fear. I started recognizing the stress I had created in others because I was now carrying a version of it myself. And it was exhausting. Up to that point, most of my concern had been focused on myself. Whether I would be caught, whether someone suspected me, whether the investigation was getting closer. Then a conversation changed everything. One evening, I was working alongside a woman named Karen. She had been at the warehouse for years and was known for staying calm no matter what happened. During a quiet moment, she mentioned that her teenage son had become worried about her safety because of the threat. She laughed while telling the story, but it wasn't a happy laugh. She explained that he kept asking her not to go to work. He checked the news constantly, and called her during breaks to make sure she was okay. She said she felt guilty for making him worry. I remember standing there, pretending to listen casually while feeling something twist in my stomach. Until then, I had mostly seen anonymous reactions, a nervous crowd, worried employees, tense supervisors. Now I could picture a frightened kid sitting at home. For the first time, the consequences felt personal. And for the first time, I genuinely wished I could take everything back. By the second week, the pressure was becoming difficult to hide. The investigation had not disappeared the way I expected. If anything, it had become more organized. New security measures were introduced. Employees were reminded to report unusual behavior. Management continued reassuring everyone that safety was a priority, but those announcements only kept the incident alive. Meanwhile, I was barely sleeping. Every night followed the same pattern. I would lie in bed replaying decisions I couldn't change. Then I would imagine different scenarios, investigators discovering evidence, coworkers connecting details, police showing up at my door. None of it happened. Yet the fear felt real enough to keep me awake. What made it worse was the isolation. I couldn't talk honestly to anyone. Every conversation required me to pretend I was just another concerned employee. The secret was becoming heavier than the crime itself. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a warehouse window and barely recognized myself. I looked exhausted. That moment forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. Even if I escaped consequences from others, I wasn't escaping consequences from myself. And that realization scared me more than the investigation ever had. A few days later, I experienced the closest thing to being caught. Near the end of a shift, my supervisor asked me to stop by a conference room before heading home. The request sounded routine, but the moment I heard it, panic hit me like a wave. I spent the walk there imagining the worst. I pictured investigators waiting inside. I imagined evidence spread across the table. I rehearsed explanations that made no sense even in my own head. By the time I reached the door, my hands were sweating. When I stepped inside, none of those things were there. The meeting had nothing to do with the threat. Management was discussing scheduling changes for the next month. That should have relieved me, but instead it left me shaken. The fear I had planted in others had changed me. A completely ordinary meeting was enough to trigger full-blown panic. As I drove home that night, I realized something important. The threat itself had lost power days earlier. What remained was the damage it created. And now I was carrying part of that damage with me everywhere I went. By that stage, I had stopped worrying about whether the threat had achieved its purpose. Whatever point I thought I was making had long since disappeared beneath the stress, rumors, and anxiety it created. I just wanted the situation to end. The problem was that there was no clean way out. Confessing seemed impossible. Every time I considered it, I imagined losing my job, disappointing my family, and becoming the person everyone talked about with disbelief. At the same time, staying silent felt increasingly dishonest. I found myself trapped between two bad options. Around that period, the investigation began slowing down. There were fewer meetings, fewer questions, and fewer conversations about the threat. People were gradually returning to their normal routines. Instead of feeling relieved, I felt ashamed. The workplace was recovering, but I knew the reason the crisis was fading. There had never been a real danger in the first place. One evening, sitting alone after work, I made a decision. I would never do anything like this again. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was simply the point where I finally admitted to myself that what I had done was wrong. Months passed, and eventually the incident became little more than a story people occasionally mentioned. New problems appeared, employees came and went, and the warehouse moved on. No one ever accused me. No investigator knocked on my door. No dramatic revelation exposed what I had done. In the simplest sense, I got away with it. For a while, I thought that outcome would make me feel fortunate. Instead, it left me with a strange emptiness. I had spent weeks expecting consequences, preparing for them, almost welcoming them as a way to bring closure. When they never arrived, the responsibility remained entirely mine. That was harder than I expected. Whenever someone brought up the old threat, I felt a familiar knot in my stomach. Most people had forgotten details, but I remembered everything. I remembered the planning, the fear, the rumors, and the worried faces. The experience changed how I viewed myself. Before then, I liked to believe that bad decisions were made by obviously bad people. What I learned was much less comfortable. Ordinary people are capable of causing harm when they become too focused on their own frustrations. Looking back now, years later, I understand that the real crime wasn't the message itself. It was the deliberate decision to manipulate other people's emotions for my own reasons. At the time, I convinced myself that fear was a useful tool. I believed I was exposing weaknesses, sending a message, or forcing people to pay attention. Those explanations sounded reasonable inside my head. They were excuses. The truth is that fear spreads faster than most people realize. Once released, it doesn't stay neatly contained. It reaches families, friends, coworkers, and complete strangers. It creates stress, suspicion, and mistrust in ways that are difficult to predict. I wasn't caught by investigators or punished in court. Instead, I spent years carrying the memory of what I had done and the knowledge that innocent people suffered unnecessary anxiety because of my actions. If anyone reading this is tempted to use fear to gain influence, make a point, or feel powerful, don't. You may think you're controlling the situation. In reality, you're creating consequences that can easily grow beyond your control. And once that happens, taking them back is impossible.